y'all, Jamie here with Country Diggers. Thought we'd go through chapter 6 of the book Pirates of the Florida Coast, Truths, Legends, and Myths by Robert Jacob. And it's chapter 6, From Pork to Gunpowder. Hope y'all enjoy. Chapter 6, From Pork to Gunpowder. Living under constant threat of Spanish attack, the French and English settlers on Tortuga and Hispaniola had developed a unique, different type of lifestyle. They had to remain extremely mobile just in case the Spanish discovered them. If they were found, they would have to get away quickly by disappearing into the vast woodlands. Farming of any sort was totally out of the question, because it took a lot of land, a lot of time, and could not be hidden. Large crops would be fairly easy for the Spanish to find and destroy. The settlers needed to find another means of making a living, and they found it. For over 100 years, livestock had been escaping from the Spanish settlements to the south and breeding in remote forests. The woodland of the interior was filled with cattle and pigs. It was a hunter's paradise. Hispaniola, like many of the islands in the Caribbean, was originally inhabited by the Taínos, an Arawak-speaking people believed to be originally from South America. Most of the Taínos had been killed by the Spanish or died from disease from European contact. However, there were a few left when the English and French settlers arrived. The Taínos had a very unique way of preparing meat. They wrapped the meat in wet leaves and placed it on a wooden platform over a very smoky, slow-burning fire. In the Arawak language of the Taínos, that process was called bucking, and the Arawak word for the dried meat it produced was charqui, which was pronounced jerky in English. Today we call the process pulled or jerked pork or beef. The settlers perfected this technique that they had learned from the Taínos and went into the meat processing business. Hence, those early hunters and cookers of meat were called buccaners by the French and buccaneers by the English. The French buccaneers and the English buccaneers worked together hunting wild boar and cattle deep in the interior of Hispaniola, all the while evading the Spanish patrols. To sell their product, they established coastal trading settlements and small ports on the western part of the island, away from the Spanish sphere of influence. The Spanish continually attempted to capture or kill these interlopers. Occasionally, the Spanish were successful, but generally the buccaneers would simply disappear into the jungle and return after the Spanish left. Since their operations were illegal in the eyes of the Spanish authority, their customers tended to be smugglers and other settlers also operating outside the Spanish control. They would trade for the necessities of life, including weapons, powder, shot, and, of course, wine. Their appearance would have been more like that of mountain men from the American West during the 1820s. They were hunters and dressed as such. Contemporary accounts describe them as wearing coarse shirts and other clothing made mostly of animal skins. No fancy garments, just handmade clothing that is adapted and practical for travel in the jungle. This lifestyle required them to be heavily armed with muskets and assorted skinning knives. They had to be prepared to both hunt wild boar and defend themselves against Spanish patrols. Additionally, they probably smelled horrible. Anyone who has spent time near a meatpacking plant would testify to that. According to a French clergyman, Abbé Jean Baptiste de Tertry, these are the butcher's vilest servants, who had been 8 days in the slaughterhouse without washing themselves. In 1629, the Spanish had had enough. Not only were these settlers from enemy nations, but to the Catholic Spanish, they were heretics too. These English, French, and Dutch invaders were all predominantly Protestants. The task of driving these heretics out was given to one of Spain's ablest generals in the 30 Years' War. Don Frederick de Tortillo was a Spanish maximum effort. It was a Spanish maximum effort to rid the Caribbean of the heretics and foreigners once and for all. Okay. His first targets were the English and French settlements on the islands of Nevis and St. Kitts. He launched major military assaults on both colonies in 1629 and captured many of the settlers. But just as many managed to escape into the interior of the islands they were on or fled to nearby islands. As soon as the Spanish left, however, the escaped settlers simply returned and rebuilt their settlements. But many others decided to seek refuge and safety on the tiny island of Tortuga, just off the northern coast of Hispaniola, which seemed to be a fairly defensible position. Even though Don Frederick de Tortello's forces enjoyed some immediate success destroying settlements and rounding up prisoners, there was no performance to his efforts. As soon as the Spanish forces left, the English, French, and Dutch settlers who escaped would return and rebuild. Overall, his campaign was a failure. Don Frederick Tortillo did manage to achieve one thing, however. His attacks instilled a deep hatred for the Spanish among all the settlers. This hatred united them against the Spanish for the rest of the century. But Don Frederick's attacks did something else. They forced the French buccaneers and the English buccaneers to seek refuge on Tortuga. In the 4 years prior to the Spanish attacks of 1629, the French and English settlers had established a small port town called Cayenne on the natural border on the south side of the island. Although it probably was unimpressive at the time, it had a market that was used primarily to sell beef and pork. It was also a central trading spot for smugglers. But beginning in 1630, with Tortuga as their stronghold, the French buccaneers and the English buccaneers became organized into a resistance force. They decided to use their hunting skills against men instead of animals. In the maximum effort to defend themselves, they completed their fortifications and made Tortuga their center of resistance and operations. Tortuga began a rapid deployment into a major port with impressive fortifications. Today it is the most famous pirate port of all time and has reached a legendary status within pirate lore, stories, novels, and Hollywood films. Despite this status, it's a real place and very deserving of its reputation. The harbor of Cayenne on Tortuga was very close to the main Spanish shipping lanes, making it fairly easy to prey on small Spanish ships. The French buccaneers and English buccaneers continued their resistance against the Spanish. Since offense is the best defense, they began taking the fight to the Spanish instead of just waiting for an attack to come. The more they fought back against the Spanish, the more they realized that taking Spanish property was far more profitable than selling meat to the odd passerby. I'm sure that a certain amount of revenge for previous Spanish atrocities also played into the situation. Additionally, capturing Spanish shipping was undoubtedly a lot more fun. Soon, Dutch adventurers began arriving to join the English and French. Their strength grew significantly, and they began a French-Dutch-English partnership against the Spanish that would dominate the Caribbean for the next 60 years. The hunters, processors, and sellers of pulled pork made the transition to a warrior culture that took ships at sea. French buccaneers and the English buccaneers became known as buccaneers, and forever afterwards the word buccaneer would be synonymous with pirate. The first era of the golden age of piracy had begun. It was the era of the buccaneer privateers. The buccaneers on Tortuga were well supported by the English, French, and Dutch governments who wanted to keep the Spanish away from their colonies. Letters of marque were issued that legitimized their actions. France finally took control of Tortuga and officially appointed Jean Levasseur as the first royal French governor of Tortuga in 1640. He was an engineer as well as a politician and immediately began construction of a large and imposing stone fortress with 40 guns on a rocky hill overlooking the natural harbor. The fort was named Fort de Rocher, and it commanded the entire city. Levasseur also issued letters of marque against the Spanish to all who applied. This act alone served to encourage buccaneers of all nations to flock to Tortuga. If that wasn't enough, in 1645, he imported 1,650 prostitutes to Tortuga in an attempt to bring harmony and control to the unruly pirates. At least that was his official story. From 1645 through 1660s, Tortuga lived up to every elaborate description and portrayal in novels and in Hollywood films. It was a seaport filled with taverns, brothels, smugglers, and buccaneers. It was a no-holds-barred kind of town, with a huge fortress on top of a hill to protect the pirates against the Spanish. It was a place where buccaneers could walk the streets and trade all their stolen booty for whatever they wanted, free from worry of being arrested. It was a port with large buccaneer fleets in the harbor refitting for the next venture. In Europe, the 30-year wars, In Europe, the 30 Years' War was finally over in 1648, and thousands of soldiers and mercenaries were out of a job, looking for quick riches. They flocked to Tortuga to begin new careers as buccaneers. These men established rules and conventions by which they lived. Many of these rules were actually written down in what would later be called the ship's articles, and buccaneers would have to agree to follow them before signing on board a vessel. It was this time when these buccaneers developed into the Brethren of the Coast. By 1650, Tortuga had become a buccaneer's haven. It was a pirate paradise that was totally unique from any other port in the world. The rise of Tortuga and the buccaneers launched a golden age of piracy in the Caribbean, which spread throughout the entire world. The era of the buccaneer privateers had begun. All right, hope you enjoy. Next will be Chapter 7, Port Royal, Jamaica, the new Buccaneer Center. See you back soon.